I'm insistent otherwise. If you call me Andrea, I will be upset. I will leave a bad review. So, um, all right. So thank you for coming on the show, Harvey. You don't maybe you don't think you know me too well, but I've seen you appear on many shows, Majority Reports and so forth. So I'm a little bit familiar with your work, but I don't know how well my audience is familiar with your work. So if you want to give like a quick, introductory, who are you? If someone doesn't know who you are at all, like what would you want them to know?
Okay, well, I'm obviously Harvey Kaye, and on Twitter it's at Harvey J K. My middle initials in there, and I grew up in the New York area, but for the past 40, I guess it's 43 years, I've been out here in Green Bay, Wisconsin, with breaks in between along the way for trips to Britain and elsewhere. But the main thing is I am about a year and a half ago, I retired as the professor of democracy and justice studies at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. My fields of study were history, politics, and sociology, but I am, by most accounts, an historian. Okay, how's that? I actually trained in Latin American studies, but I got, to make the long story short, deeply invested in reading and writing about a group of British intellectuals known as the British Marxist historians. And my very first book back in 1980, the winter of 84-85, was in fact titled The British Marxist Historians. And it came out in a later edition in the 90s. The only thing that changes the edition is the forward or preface that I've added to it. And the newest edition, after all of these years, is coming out next fall.
Okay.
With 0 books. But otherwise, my work during the 80s had to do with these scholars, the British Marxist historians, who really captured my imagination. I think taught me a great deal about everything from class struggle to how to write history. And early in the 90s, though, actually, I should say in the middle of the 80s, I was going back and forth between Britain and the United States. And I was fascinated by how Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Britain, and Ronald Reagan were using and abusing the past. And I began to write about the fact that the new right's politics depended heavily on hijacking the progressive story in the British case and the American case, and basically suppressing in diverse ways the telling of what I would actually call the radical story of American democracy.
Yeah.
And
Like that's like
so,
what the
yeah,
right likes to do is they like to like take and cherry pick all the good parts and then like kind of mythologize it and like make it
yeah.
seem like it's a hero story of like, and then they just ignore and step on and distort all the other perspectives. And that's what I like about your work is I love the historian like angles of like, because the history is there, but it's like the interpretation is really the most important part. Because without that interpretation, it's just like you don't know the context, you don't know much about the time period, you don't know how to discern what this means, and so that's why I think your work is valuable because we need to understand because America does have this like through line of very progressive radicals that really want a good world. It's just that they so far have lost most of the way, but they have made wins, and so like as far as like like what the major like progressive wins throughout this country would be, like what do you think are the most important?
Well, I'll just finish and then I'll
Yeah,
answer
go
that
for
very
it.
critical question. So in the 90s, I really turned my attention from British Marxists to the American story, the American radical story. And my childhood hero was Thomas Paine, ever since I was 10 years old, which is a story in itself.
Mm-hmm.
But I ended up doing some editing and writing about the American radical tradition. And I published a book for young adults with Oxford University Press in 2000 titled Thomas Paine, Firebrand of Revolution, which actually won a major New York Public Library Award. And I decided I was not going to give up my hero, Thomas Paine, so readily. So I wrote a more significant book. I'm not so sure it's significant for young people, but it's significant for the larger American audience, titled Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. And I have to say that in many ways, that's my love letter to the radical America that I have been studying and celebrating. And in the course of doing that, and by the way, and even to this day, Tom Paine is my guy, but even in the course of doing that, because I retold the American story, not just the story of Thomas Paine and his revolutionary influence.
Yeah, the context
I
is
actually,
super important.
I came upon a remarkable speech by Franklin Roosevelt by the way, it was February 23rd, 1942. So it was 80 years ago this winter, in which he's in the wake of Pearl Harbor and the devastating losses the United States was suffering and its allies in the Pacific and elsewhere. He gave a speech, and he opens a speech with Washington's retreat across New Jersey and the likelihood of the suppression and crushing and suppression of the revolution. And then he closes with Thomas Paine's famous words from the first of his crisis papers: "These are the times that try men's souls." And I decided, wow, I should pay more attention to FDR's and the generation that he led, because I think there's a progressive story that had been suppressed, because conservatives just trashed his memory, and liberals utterly ignored the radicalism of his New Deal politics and the radicalism of a generation. I'll call it at least the progressivism of a generation. So I wrote a book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms: What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Truly Great. And then in the wake of that, just to make the longer story short, I brought out a couple of years ago this collection of speeches and essays. People can see this, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's mirrored, but yeah, take hold of our history is what it says.
Make America Radical Again. Mm-hmm. And it's came out in paperback, readily available. And I'll just tell you, it didn't even occur to me that Trump's slogan was "Make America Great Again." It was a subconscious thing, perhaps, when I came up with "Make America Radical Again."
Sure.
Because I had already begun to publish on Americans are radicals at heart. Don't forget it. So it seemed sort of emanated from that. And then, last but not least, a year or so ago, I brought out FDR on Democracy, which is, I went back through the speeches, and people may not be able to see it. I'll move my camera. I've got all of FDR's, they're all available now online, but before that, I had bought all of FDR's public papers.
Okay.
The volumes, and so for this book on FDR and democracy, I went through all of his writings, and I chose the ones that I felt spoke especially to the question of democracy and his own sort of understanding historically and very much intentional regarding and aspirational regarding the future of his ideas on democracy. So that's also out. And there's a lot of stuff in between, but that's where I'll leave the story of my work.
Okay.
And come back to your question about those moments in the American past that we must remember. We actually, in a fashion, do remember, but I don't think we remember them in the fashion that we ought to remember them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to start at the high points, you might say. And let me just note as a footnote to all of it, no, a sidebar to all of this, that my feeling is that Americans are essentially radicals at heart, that from Thomas Paine's moment in the Revolution on, Americans sort of were imbued with a sense of what it meant to be an American, which also is expressed in the Declaration's line about equality and the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And however much Americans may have, if you like, have forgotten certain things, they carry around a sort of deep cultural memory of this, which unfortunately, the Democratic Party about 45 years ago stopped talking to. They stopped trying to engage that kind of sensibility, that radical or progressive sensibility. So having said that, let me put it this way. Why do I think Americans are radicals at heart? Well, I'm going to now answer your question in that fashion.
Okay.
So the three, if you ask, twofold. First, if you ask Americans who the three greatest presidents or leaders have been in American history, for all of our reservations about any one of them, for all of their sins and failures and omissions and all of that, that's not the issue right now. Keep in mind the times in which they lived and led. The three greatest, every American will probably tell you: Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. And they could possibly leave out FDR if they're really some kind of right winger who wants to include Reagan, which is a farcical notion. Okay. But so let's go with, as historians and the majority of Americans would say, Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. Now, if you ask Americans beyond that, well, what makes them so great? They'll tell you instinctively, because that's what they've been taught in school and what over and over again politicians repeat and pundits repeat, the story. And what they'll tell you is because they led us through these three major wars in American history: the Revolution, the Civil War, and the Second World War. And I just want to say that there's this great quote that I found in a book by one of FDR's closest advisors when he was first running for president, who served throughout his presidency in various capacities. This man's name was Rexford Tugwell. He wrote The Democratic Roosevelt back in the 50s. And he said, we're a lucky people. We have had leaders when the national life was at stake. If it had not been for Washington, we might not have become a nation. If it had not been for Lincoln, we might have been split in two. If it had not been for this later Democrat, Franklin Roosevelt, we might have succumbed to a dictatorship. Now, here's the thing. I love that quote, but it's wrong. Okay? It's wrong to this extent. Yeah, I'm not going to deny the place of luck. But it's also the case that at significant moments in the American story, Americans propelled into leadership the right figures for the moment. And what was it that made their leadership significant? Well, yeah, they led in significant wars. But here's the other thing. When Americans have confronted mortal crises, that is, when the American story is at stake, we might say, or the American promise is at stake, or the American, if you like, polity, the sense of what it means to be American is at stake, somehow Americans, despite all of their faults and failings, have actually confronted their enemies and transcended the crises that they confronted by making America more free, more equal, and more democratic. Now, that doesn't mean we created a democracy in any kind of comprehensive sense. It didn't mean that freedom prevailed for all. And it didn't mean that equality in any fashion prevailed for all. But what it did mean is that the way in which the struggle was engaged and secured was by going radical. And that sort of emanates from this kind of instinctive American radicalism. So despite everything, the revolution created the makings of a democratic republic. The Civil War, to win the Civil War, it's arguable that it required Lincoln, who hated slavery, but was propelled by two forces, Southern slaves who were leaving the plantations as the Union armies approached. And by the way, they left and ran to the Union lines and volunteered basically to serve the Union cause, which was, especially after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, the complete abolition of slavery. And 250,000 Southern blacks, and Northern blacks together, served in the Union Army, and their numbers surely helped secure the victory over the Confederacy, the treacherous, traitorous Confederacy. But as well, Northern whites who had enlisted, working men, farmers, and others, when they wrote home, and people have basically gone through these letters, have been collected, what they've revealed is the degree to which that these Northern working men and the women who served them as nurses, etc., recognized that they were fighting for the question of freedom and liberty and the end of slavery. Okay, and what happens? We secure the abolition of slavery. So Washington and Lincoln led a moment, okay, propelled by forces from below. I didn't mention that Washington's own leadership. Washington himself, sorry, I'm going to backtrack a little bit.
Okay, no problem.
Washington himself, as much as he was already a general in the field with the American Army, had not come out in favor of an American revolution. He thought he was leading Americans to secure the rights of Britons. But after Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, appeared, Washington recognized that his own troops were now committed to the idea of a revolution, independence, and the end of monarchy and aristocracy. And he wrote to someone significant in his own forces, but was back in Philadelphia, and he said, Common Sense, that pamphlet, is working a wondrous change in the minds of men. And until that moment, Washington never came out in favor of turning the colonial rebellion into a revolution, but it was this force, this propulsion from below that led him to do that. By the way, even in January of 1776, around the time Paine was about to publish that pamphlet, whenever Washington would gather his officers for dinner, when it was possible, they toasted the King of England at the beginning of the dinners. But after the appearance of Common Sense, I don't think they toasted the king any longer.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I came across that by accident, really, in a small piece years ago. And then if we come forward to Roosevelt, it's even more interesting to think that Roosevelt's greatness is not simply the leadership in World War II, even more significantly in many ways. That's not fair to say more significantly, no less significantly, we'll say, is his leadership into the New Deal. And there is no question about his progressive politics when he ran for president first time in 32. In fact, he even said to a very close friend, I think it's time for America to become radical, fairly radical, for at least a generation. But what enabled him to move even beyond his own reservations on question after question was the propulsion from below of working men and women in unions, in housewives movements, and in the burgeoning civil rights movement. So over and over again, for all of his failings, he had certain progressive aspirations which working people propelled him to pursue. As I put it, FDR pushed working people and working people pushed FDR. And as a consequence, there was, in many ways, a radical transformation in American life in the 1930s. For the first time ever, government will address the needs of working people. The labor movement expanded dramatically and radically, and did so again during World War II. I mean, over and over again, we see what these leaders do, propelled by popular aspirations and energies, is they go even further in the progressive or radical direction than they might otherwise have gone. And so when people say, what are those moments? I actually maybe surprise them. And I say, well, it's the Revolution, the Civil War, the Great Depression, World War II. We've got these three presidents we all admire, but how much do we appreciate the degree to which these are truly radical, if not revolutionary moments in American history? So there's my answer to that question. And I could go on and talk about great movements all the way through American history.
Sure. Well, okay, so now, but how does that lead us into where we are now, right? Because like now, especially with the last week, it seems like the world is in extreme crisis, just all over, of course, with the invasion of Ukraine and Europe, and the Eastern, like the stock market in Russia is collapsing. Millions of people are being plunged into poverty. Gas prices in the United States are going crazy. And Biden just gave a State of the Union. And now, personally, I don't know what you feel about it. I don't know if you've talked about it too much, but I was not a fan of the State of the Union. But I know Biden wasn't really talking to people like me. But like, how do you feel like it feels like we're entering this moment of crisis? A lot of people want to say like the pandemic's ending. I'm not as convinced by that. I don't think it is ending. I think it's, probably just going to be a thing that we're going to be dealing with for a long time. I don't think the end is too close. But we've been in this kind of perpetual crisis mode, and it seems to be getting worse.
Let's use that word perpetual for a moment. I think this crisis is rooted. Most people listening probably aren't even old enough to have been around at the time I'm going to say the crisis begins. The crisis actually begins, or at least its roots, and the only way to understand it is in the 1970s. In the 1970s, in the wake of for lack of a better term, the kind of tumultuous 60s, and the movements of labor, of working people, of women, of gay and lesbian folk, in the wake of those movements that really were transforming the United States in radical ways, the dominant force in American corporate life has always been the capitalists. And this is key. The social changes of the 60s were unsettling, but what really was threatening the capitalist class is the fact that there was a profit squeeze in the early 70s. And this is a consequence of developments that went back to the New Deal. The labor movement was strong. One of every three workers in the mid-50s was a member of a labor union. So what you have, first of all, is that between 1938 and 1973, in spite of the fact the rich got richer, it's also the case that inequality in the United States actually decreased because working people were actually gaining ground, so that even though the rich got richer, working people were rising at no less a rapid pace. What that meant is that they were garnering a greater share of the national income. And then at the same time, Germany and Japan are recovering from the devastation of World War II, And in the 60s into the 70s, their industries are starting to seriously compete with American industry. So capitalists are saying to themselves, my God, there's a profit squeeze. The bankers are worried. And in short, they declared war on American working people. There was the famous Lewis Powell Memorandum of 1971. It was a prominent lawyer out of Virginia who sent a memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and laid out the degree to which capital was under siege and that capital needed to respond by going after labor, environmentalists, all of the forces that in some ways were placing demands to either increase the income of working people or to raise taxes on capital and the rich to pay for greater social services. That's one. And by the way, 2 weeks later, that Lewis Powell was nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court by Richard Nixon.
Well,
yeah. And then in the course of the early 70s, that's on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, David Rockefeller, one of the Rockefeller brothers, who was the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, he told a group of bankers that it was essential that capital mobilize against these pressures from below. There were studies done, in fact, not by people on the left, but by mainstream business columnists that showed that when asked, there were those business leaders who would say, maybe democracy and capitalism just don't do well together. We got to reduce democracy's importance in this country. Well, in 1974, David Rockefeller underwrote the organizing of something called the Trilateral Commission. The man who actually organized it for him was Samuel P. Huntington. It was Brzezinski. Zbigniew Brzezinski organized it, professor of international relations. And it was called the Trilateral Commission. It included corporate and political leaders from Western Europe, the United States, and Japan. And they commissioned a report titled, I'll do a show and tell. This is my copy of the report, published by New York University Press, The Crisis of Democracy.
Okay.
And in this, notice the name Samuel P. Huntington. That's why I was about to say Huntington before. Mm-hmm. Samuel P. Huntington wrote the section on the United States, and he made it clear that perhaps there was an excess of democracy in the United States. Labor was pressing, women were pressing, students were pressing, the liberal media was causing trouble, and they called it the value-oriented academics and intellectuals, which meant people in the humanities and social sciences, that these were causing trouble, and the United States could not sustain the democratic distemper, and that's the words they used. So you had this mobilization of business, right and center. In fact, some of them were actually considered liberals, okay, to try to, suppress the democratic spirit that had emanated from the 60s. And among the members of the Trilateral Commission were two figures who would go on to become president of the United States. One was Jimmy Carter, and the other was George H.W. Bush. That's the father, right? Mm-hmm. So he ran for vice president under Reagan. Now, Jimmy Carter, who I consider to be one of the worst presidents the Democratic Party has produced in the 20th century, he is actually the man who sort of brought into the White House and government the ideas of neoliberalism. And so in 78, he turned his back on labor and the environmental movements and basically ends up appointing Volcker to head up the Federal Reserve, mm-hmm. and they pursue austerity. By the way, the word austerity, which is very key to the neoliberal ethos, was actually used by Carter in his speeches, not by Reagan, to my knowledge, okay? I mean, I know it's in Carter's speeches. I've gone through Reagan's speeches. I don't remember the word austerity ever appearing, okay? So here's the 70s. Basically, from the 70s to the very present day, what we have seen, whether it's by way of conservative politics or neoliberal politics in the Democratic Party, we have seen class war on workers' rights, women's rights, and voters' rights to overturn the advances of the 60s. And they've, over those 45 years, they've won over and over again. And the best evidence is not the degree to which we've seen Republicans secure the presidency and pursue their agenda, from Reagan, to Bush, to Trump, who's kind of like Reagan on steroids, basically. What we have also seen is a series of neoliberal Democratic presidents after Carter. So that's Clinton, Obama, and frankly, although Biden laid out a very seemingly progressive agenda last year, we've not seen him mobilize either the Democrats, and most importantly, as FDR had done, mobilize American working people in all their diversity, right, to demand and to push himself and the Democratic Party. And if I can just keep talking for a moment.
Yeah, feel free.
Let's go back a year, okay? He celebrated the American Rescue Plan the other night, right? Joe Biden. We can talk about the State of the Union. So we'll bring it right into the question you had.
Absolutely.
He celebrated the American Rescue Plan. The American Rescue Plan was wonderful, great legislation. But think about this. First of all, the child tax credit was for 1 year. That's over. Okay.
It's just reminding people that, oh yeah, this cool thing we did last year, well, you don't have it anymore.
Right. And let's go back to a year, in fact, to the question of the $15 an hour minimum wage. And let's not forget, it was not the Republicans obstructing its passage. It was 8 Democratic senators, or at least 6 who did, including a man that Biden himself cited or named in the course of his State of the Union address, Chris Coons, the senator from Delaware, whom Biden himself mentored in politics. And Biden then went on to talk about the imperative of passing a $15 minimum wage. Well, where the hell was he a year ago? Why didn't he call Coons and the other guys in and say, and women, and say, make my internet connection is unstable. Can you still hear me?
It's good. You're good?
Okay. I don't know why that happened, but it came up. But the point is, that was so telling and tragic that we didn't see that. And of course, we can also remind ourselves the year has gone by, and has Biden absolved people of $10,000 of their student debt? I mean, even Schumer wanted to see a $50,000, wanted to see that, forgiven. So I mean, this is
at least he said publicly that he would like that to happen. We all know that behind the scenes, and as you're laying out, they don't really care. Like, they use these things as like political cudgels without doing any of the work, and then they just kind of forget about it.
Yeah, well, if we look close, I'm not convinced that Schumer didn't want to see it actually happen, because I think he imagined that it would be a tremendous economic boost. And Schumer has always been recognized as the defender of hedge funds. Okay, not specifically the defender of banks, but the defender of hedge funds. So you might have imagined you'll liberate all those folks from that kind of debt, and they'll start spending money in ways that they hadn't done so
That's
before.
True.
Who knows? Okay, I mean, but the point is, the Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate over and over again has failed to push Biden himself. I mean, call him out. Okay, FDR, to go back to one of my presidential figures, FDR regularly called on Americans to push him over and over again. In 1935, FDR, when it looked like the Supreme Court was going to undo some of the major things that they had enacted earlier, and they did, in fact, he actually told Americans, look, new laws in themselves do not bring the millennium. You're still going to have to struggle. And he sent his cabinet out around the country to promote social movements, to bring pressure to bear. I mean, there's lots of stories like that. And we've just not seen that from Biden. So let's talk about the State of the Union. I mean, the biggest failing to my mind, I got from the left, people attacked me because I think probably because I said he hit the right notes. However, the notes just hung there in the air. And what I also said is, but ultimately he said nothing. And of course, then I got the liberals to attack me for having said that. And what I meant by that is, if you're going to offer a truly progressive, I mean, let's face it, we're never going to get radicalism out of Biden, but let's imagine a small p progressivism that he seemed to promise. That I celebrated the fact Bernie was the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, because that meant that he would be able to set an agenda and keep Biden somewhat honest, right? And they proposed many a thing which It's called Build Back Better, right?
Yeah, we'll see if it ever happens.
Right now, I mean, I wouldn't bet on it. I'm sure you wouldn't either. But it's the case that if it really was going to be a speech to rev up the democratic American people, that what he needed to say is, how about this? So when he got to work, he made reference to the importance of passing the PRO Act. One sentence, pass the PRO Act. But if he really meant that, here's what he should have done. Do you also remember who he brought on and was sitting in the gallery? The CEO of Intel?
Mm-hmm.
The billionaire head of Intel, right? Because he was going to invest, I don't know, $20 billion in Eastern Ohio. Although they happen, let me come back to that in a moment. If Biden was serious about pass the PRO Act, he would have invited some of the Starbucks workers who were organizing to try to get recognition for their union. He would have put them in the gallery. Or perhaps he would have brought Chris Smalls, the Amazon, former Amazon worker, whether he's with them now or not, I don't remember. The point is that who was trying to organize.
Yeah,
and is still pursuing.
And it's real quick. It's not like Joe Biden doesn't know what's going on. I mean, last year he was in support of the Bessemer, Alabama union effort.
We had little evidence he was in support.
He talked about it at least.
Yeah, exactly.
So he knows that this movement is there, and he chose to just ignore them.
Well, and the trick is that if he had brought Chris Smalls on, or he had brought some Starbucks workers on, or a year ago we brought somebody from Bessemer on, or maybe a mine workers leader from Alabama, if he brought them on and had them in the gallery, that would have been a signal to workers to organize all the more energetically and to make demands all the more, like the Kellogg's workers who had a union, but basically they didn't have decency in the workplace. Okay. The idea is that's the kind of thing that we should have seen him doing. That's on that question. I mean, when he got to the question of women's rights and the right to choose, maybe he would have said, he might have dropped in, maybe it's time for a new women's march. Just drop in the line, right? I mean, there are things that he could have done, which would have required another sentence that would have inspired or encouraged perhaps the kind of action from below, which, by the way, it doesn't mean things would have happened. The Supreme Court is still going to devastate the rights of Americans. I mean, it's set up that way. The Congress is still going to have to deal with the likes of Manchin, the Democrats, and Sinema, and Chris Coons. But here's the key thing. Over the horizon is November 2022. And though the Republicans may not be able to win all the seats that they aspire to take back from the Democrats, let Americans know that their energies matter and that the Democratic Party is allied with the struggles. And then they'll see a turnout, because the biggest problem in a midterm election is not that the Republicans will gain votes. It's that the folks who voted for the Democrats before just won't turn out. So imagine 18 to 30-year-olds who still have massive student debt. Are they excited by what they've seen the Democratic Party do? They generally don't turn out in midterms as they would in a presidential year. Give them reason. Joe, just pick up the pen. Think how exciting it would have been if that night he had held up a pen up there on the podium and said,
and just signed the executive orders.
Yep, here's the pen I'm going to use to absolve $50,000 of student debt for every student indebted, or all of it, whatever it might have been. You can imagine all across the country. The next day, people would have been, well, I'm exaggerating, dancing in the streets, but you got the idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing about the State of the Union is that, like, he not only in a lot of ways just ignored or pretended like left movements don't exist, but I mean, one of the big moments was that he was trashing on the defund the police movement. Like, even if you disagree with the movement to defund the police or reform the police, just like the point of the president openly trashing it is just unnecessary, right? Like, it's just, to me, it just feels like punching down for the sake of it. And we've been seeing this a lot with a lot of this propaganda coming out of the centrist Democratic wing, talking about how the squad is destroying the party when their policies aren't even being passed, right? So, like, we're seeing this, like, backlash against, like, people just saying, hey, we would like this, not even like really pushing for it. Like, the squad isn't really capable of pushing for this in Congress too much. They're still too, like, they're not powerful enough in size. And, you know, we saw some good results in the primaries in Texas the other day, so maybe they will have more members of the squad coming soon. But, you know, it seems that the centrist wing, the neoliberal wing, is really, like, they're trying to, like, stamp out a lot of the more radical parts of the, like, whether or not you want to consider them parts of the Democratic Party or just radical movements that are, existing in tandem with the Democratic Party. It seems like they're trying to like push back against that a little bit as well.
Yeah, look, I thought it was unfortunate that the call went out as defund the police. I wanted to hear demilitarize the police, okay, or reform the police, whatever it might have been. And by the way, the squad, I've not heard them in Congress call for defunding the police. So that that it's outrageous the way in which Biden literally bought into the Republican propaganda. So having or centrist Democrat propaganda for that matter. But what was really amazing is that he couldn't figure out a way to articulate. This is always the thing that gets to me. He couldn't figure out a way to articulate both the aspirations of the Black Lives Movement alongside of the imperative of gun control. Right? That was amazing. I mean, yeah, he dropped a line about gun control and all that. But the fact is that whoever is writing his speeches or encouraging him to say certain kinds of things, they're our greatest obstacle probably to, by the way, that's a good point you made. I want to add another point, which I thought was punching down. Why does Biden constantly feel the need to say that bullshit line, I'm a capitalist? I mean, that's like, it's like, how many times does he have to slap Bernie, you might say? Okay. That's utterly, sorry, can I use the F word?
Go for it.
It's fucking ridiculous when he does that. It's for a start, it's fucking ridiculous because as much money as he may make in certain kinds of investments, he's been a goddamn public servant all of his career. He's not been the head of a company. He's not been a corporate boss. Okay. So that's just outrageous. But again, he showed his alliance. As I said, he brought the CEO of Intel on to sit in the gallery. He didn't bring any labor figures on. He could at least have brought a labor leader like my friend Sarah Nelson, the head of the airline flight attendants, to be there, which would, assuming she would have said yes to being there, but she might have wanted to know what he was going to say before she did. Mm-hmm. But so let's put it this way. I tweeted it, I think, in sum, he said the right things, but he said nothing at all. Ultimately, there was no narrative to bind together all of these throwaway lines.
Yeah, like it was just kind of like participating in like the Republican-led culture war, but like from his perspective, right? Like he didn't try to like move the needle on the culture war at all. He just kind of like, yeah, the Republicans say that we wanted to fund the police. Well, I gave them 3 times the funding. So look at me. And then it's like, well, okay, well, you just bought into the whole framing of Republicans and you're just like wasting your time with their propaganda war. And he really gave very little to like anyone. And we can make the argument that Joe Biden's not talking to us. He's talking to, the group of swing voters and their imaginations, like that are going to swing to Democrats again or something. I don't know. It just seems it's so haphazard to me what coalition they're even trying to build here.
Yeah. In his favor, I want to say he didn't use the line, the soul of America.
Oof. Yeah, that's trure. That's true.
That's like that. I knew we were in trouble when John Meacham became his primary historical advisor, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. But the fact is, just think if he had done the kinds of things that a Lincoln or FDR was capable of doing, of talking about the meaning of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And FDR said, look, life means you have to have a job and an income capable of supporting life. First of all, liberty means you have to be enabled to exercise those rights. He always took it back to the need for economic security and enabling liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Well, if he's going to talk about the $15 an hour minimum wage, if he's going to talk about all of these things, he might have said, the American promise, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness requires these things. But I'm convinced that in many ways you're right. He was basically, but even if he had used life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he would have been able to speak to the suburban, soccer moms and Republican voter. And by the way, most of those folks despise a good part of what the Republican Party is. So the trick is to remind them of who they are and why they need to vote for Democrats, even if they're not the most progressive Democrats. You want to fill the seats. In the meantime, you and I, of course, want to see progressives unseat centrist Democrats in the primaries. My biggest hope right now is that Nina Turner can win in Cleveland. And I've been, in constant contact with Nina, trying, encouraging her, and she's been encouraging me on what you heard the other day at the Progressive Democrats of America town hall, the pursuit of an economic bill of rights for all Americans.
Yeah, like that's another thing as well, is that like, like you were saying with FDR, it's like a feedback loop where like FDR would push the movements to push him, and then it would go further and further in that realm. But with Biden, we're seeing, like, and like we can talk about Bernie in a second too, because he's like the kind of de facto progressive leader as well. But Biden's like pushing back at all times. And then like Bernie, I think Bernie is doing a good job, but I wish he would do better in trying to like channel these movements and bring like a bigger coalition. Like we need a way to like try to bring the power of like the Black Lives Matter movement with the labor movement, and like, like the modern day civil rights movement with like, especially with gay and trans rights and stuff after what's going on in Texas. We need to find the bridges with all these movements so that we can unify our power. And I wish that Bernie would do that a little bit more explicitly, but also he's, old. And that's what I feel like about Nina Turner, is that every time like she speaks, she does a really good job of like bringing those kinds of movements together, the diverse like group of like, struggles, but like all for like the common, like we got to unify under this, because as long as we're set, like, like in these separate groups fighting for these things, and like these things are good and we need to fight for them, without the unified power, we're just kind of, we're all fighting against each other in that sense.
Right. Well, in the 1930s, the broad movements of the left came together in what was called the Popular Front. And we need something like that. And in this book of my essays and speeches of the last, now 12 years, I actually say what we desperately need if we're going to make history is a broad coalition of the left, a united front. And by the way, there's no reason why we couldn't use life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as the slogan of that struggle. I like the pursuit of the economic bill of rights, but here's a thought. My ambition, and I think it's that of my co-author on this, Alan Minsky, the executive director of Progressive Democrats, is to try to get at least a coalition of, say, progressive Democrats, of labor unions, of Our Revolution, the organization Bernie launched that Nina Turner was so actively involved in. To get these kinds of folks together, the Poor People's Movement that Reverend Barber's heading up right now, to at least subscribe to this idea of an economic bill of rights for all Americans, okay, as a start. And beyond that, we could literally say, look, as FDR understood, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is not what the right-wingers like Newt Gingrich or, I don't want to go through the whole litany of names.
Yeah, like they have these distorted definitions of these words that like aren't real.
Yeah, they've hijacked it, absolutely hijacked the terms. And our trick is to lay claim, as I say, take hold of our history, let it inspire us not to necessarily try to live the past or to try to, for that, look, when I heard people say we're looking forward to returning to normal, well, screw returning to normal. Normal was 45 years of class war on working people and the rights, the democratic rights that were achieved in the 60s and the 70s. Our trick is not to go back to normal. Our trick is our ambition or our aspiration is to literally reclaim the vision of those movements. There was a writer around 1900, he died early 20th century, named Henry Demarest Lloyd. And I'm never quite sure if this was his argument or the argument of another figure in the late 19th century, Wendell Phillips, who was an abolitionist, a labor advocate, a women's rights advocate. And here's the line. It's, people think that to protect liberty, we have to be vigilant. And that's true. But as Henry Demarest Lloyd put it, the defense of liberty requires more than vigilance. It means that we have to defend the rights that our ancestors accorded us and afforded us by providing new rights for our children. You cannot defend by standing still.
You got to keep the ball rolling?
You've got to keep the ball rolling. I mean, if America truly is, or was at least, a grand experiment in democracy, every experimental method demands you test new things. You look for ways to move ahead. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to be the grand experiment, sure as hell, we've got to not just defend the rights of the past, we have to build upon those rights and afford new rights in line with this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Absolutely. We've got like about 15 or so minutes left, so I want to ask the audience if they have any questions, just like about what we talked about or any other adjacent topics. But also, I just want to say thank you for coming on the show. I've been having a good conversation. I hope you're having a good one as well.
Oh, thank you. No, as I said, I was looking forward to it, and I'm not at all disappointed. This is fun.
All right. And again, if you want to come back on the show anytime, if something comes up that you want to talk about, just send me a message. Like we were talking about, I do a show every single day. So,
Yeah, I was pretty impressed when you told me how many days you're doing the show.
Yep, 7 days a week.
Course,
a lot of
enough
people
to have the energy, so good for you.
That's true. I'm going to use it while I can. But a lot of people do a daily show on the weekdays, and it's like, no. Daily show is 7 days a week.
Yeah,
but yeah, go on.
For what it's worth, I do between YouTube, radio, and podcasts. I do at least five shows a week, and this was a good hour. Your invitation to come in late morning, that's unique. People often ask you want to come in at night or whatever else. So thank you. It's great.
Yeah. I try to situate myself in like the most comfortable time slot for me. And so, that's kind of what I'm doing. All right. So we have one question here from Sal Noran. What kind of music do you listen to?
Good. Okay. So depends on what I'm doing.
Okay.
If I'm driving, I'm capable of listening to everything from. Don't laugh, because I often imagine myself. It's on a drive to St. Louis, going south to visit my grandson who's just turned 7. I could listen to anything as long as driving, like country and western over to progressive jazz. But I will tell you, there's a guy, Robert Randolph. I don't know if people have heard of Robert Randolph and the Family Band. And he plays a slide guitar, and his stuff is great for driving, okay? But I found myself this morning listening to online music from Miami Vice in its several seasons. Everything from the Pointer Sisters and Lionel Richie to Simply Red. I always loved Simply Red. UB40, a whole host of groups from back then. Okay. But today I often listen. I'll turn on. Stuff that's embarrassingly pop even today. I like Sheeran. I like Ed Sheeran a lot. And I will tell you, when I was in high school back in the late 60s, I innovated in high school level. I brought a New York sort of rock jazz folk group called the Blues Project to my high school to perform.
Okay.
And if anyone wants to go online, check out the Blues Project. I don't think they're around at all any longer, but it's the kind of sound that I do like a lot. And I'm sure I'm leaving out something that really does mean a lot to me.
Well, we'll ask the question again next time. That way you'll be able to get the honorable mentions. All right, so I have another question from About to Sleep.
But ask Sal what kind of music Sal likes.
All right, Sal. There you go. The ball's in your court. All right, so About to Sleep asks, how can the left stop infighting and get behind progressive candidates to actually win elections? I mean, I'm sure you could write a whole book on how that is possible, but in a short amount of time, what do you think? I'm
going to first of all lament the passing of my very, very dear friend Michael Brooks. Okay, Michael was unwilling to fall. He really was. This is now. We're talking. It seems like so long ago, and yet so close. So that's. Michael, I did Michael's show a lot. I did one of his. Michael and I were very close. We were in daily contact. And one thing I knew was that Michael was he's really pissed off about the emerging infighting on the left.
And it's only gotten worse.
It's only gotten worse, right? And I think if Michael had lived, if he had still around, that tragedy had not occurred, I think he would have been a significant voice in compelling us to not allow ourselves to get sucked into this kind of stuff. And it's just, I will tell you that, look, I have no affection whatsoever for the likes of Jimmy Dore. I'll make that very clear. I've never listened to him. I used to appreciate him when I was on the Young Turks. I thought he was part of a sort of broad left kind of politics, but I just think that that's been ruinous for the left. So how to transcend it? Let's ask ourselves, what is the left supposed to be about? It's supposed to make American and people around the world, it's supposed to make their lives better, right? And how do you do that? Well, for a start, you not only think grandly, you also think on the ground kinds of things. What? Okay. So my feeling is that we on the left, if we are not aligned with workers and the labor movement, we will never prevail. To my mind, if you do not have a small d democratic, small p progressive labor movement, you do not ever find a successful left. And partly this infighting on the left is a consequence of the fact that labor has yet to be revived and become more democratically aggressive as it has been in the past. So we should give our energies in favor of the labor movement and other social movements that are seeking to improve the lives of everyday Americans. But I'm a labor unionist, and I think that the left must align itself as much as possible with these percolating struggles of workers, from Starbucks and Kellogg's to Alabama mine workers and Amazon workers. And wherever workers are struggling to get a democratic voice in the workplace, that's where a lot of our energies and solidarity should go.
All right. I have a very good, like, kind of similar question that is on this too that I want to throw at you from The Wasting Times. And so The Wasting Times asked if you have any particular, I'm not sure if you've heard of Richard Wolff's opinion on the freedom convoy thing going on. But, like, you know, there's a lot of these, like, right-wing, like, we were talking about how the right-wing hijacks, like, things like life, liberty, right. And, you know, they've also been trying to hijack these, like, you know, what they call themselves, like, worker, like, we want rights, we're anti-mandate for the workers. But, like, you know, a lot of the times they're just funded by, like, right-wing groups, and they're really just trying to distract and you know, just kind of tear things apart. But, you know,
And by the way, what you just said is what I think.
Okay. Yeah. So, but they're asking if you have any particular opinion on, like, you know, Richard Wolff's opinion, which you may or may not know, but that, you know.
I'm not familiar enough with his specific opinion. Okay. Mm-hmm. My thinking is that we have to reach out to labor. I find, look, the anti-vaxxing and anti-mask mandates, the movements that are seeking to undo that, we know where the monies are coming from. We know what they're about. Look, anybody who thinks that we're going to somehow appropriate the freedom convoy or anything like it, I think they're fooling themselves. And I wouldn't bother to debate it. There's smarts and there's not smarts.
All right. I like that answer. That pretty much sums up my thoughts too. So we have another question as well. We have a historically strong anti-radical, anti-populist force in the Democratic Party establishment that is known to co-opt and break left movements. How do we get around this?
Well, let's start with the word solidarity, okay? Now, the first thing is we can't be purists, okay? We can't be purists. So if indeed the person who's running locally, who has a chance of winning and holding on to a Democratic seat and is not challenged by a progressive, then you hold your nose and you vote for the Democrat. That's what you got to do. Okay. I mean, I'm not saying that we're not going to fight to make the squad a greater presence. I am saying that. Okay. If there's a progressive who's running in a primary, you support the progressive. If the progressive loses and the Democrat is a centrist, it's far better. It's far, far better to see that centrist back in Congress than to see the Republicans take seats. I don't buy catastrophe theory. Catastrophe theory says if you can force the catastrophe, you're going to emerge from the catastrophe with a more progressive politics. This goes back to a kind of, I don't know, it's almost a Stalinist view of things, okay? It just doesn't happen. If it was true, then we would have ended up with a more progressive leader than Obama. If it's true, we would have ended up with a more progressive leader than Biden. Catastrophes guarantee nothing. Action, politics, supporting the right candidates, that's what makes things happen. And in fact, if you think about catastrophes historically, think about the early 30s, we were lucky that out of our catastrophe, we emerged with Franklin Roosevelt. But if you think about what happened in Central Europe, they ended up with Nazis and fascists. Okay.
It doesn't always go the right way, for sure.
And merely because Nazis and fascists takes power doesn't mean that people come to see the light and all of a sudden join socialists in their politics. I mean, Does that help sort of get at the question?
It gets a little bit going. It's all good. What things can you point to give us hope that Nina can win this time, despite now facing an incumbent? So last time it was like an open seat. Now she's going up against.
Okay, there has been a redistricting, and from what I understand, I haven't seen the final boundaries. The redistricting might well strengthen the places in the city where Nina was strongest.
Okay.
And it might have expanded those sections of the district.
Okay.
So I think there's that. Here's another thing. It was that she was well ahead in the polls early on. Okay. And then money poured in. The trick is that this time around in the fall, it's not a special election. It's a congressional election. A congressional election is not as good as a presidential election year to try to get folks elected, but it's far better than a special election moment.
For sure.
Okay, so I support Nina. I don't have a lot of money, but I've given what little I can give, and I've been in conversation with Nina to try to to help articulate the kinds of things that I believe in, and she's been. I'm telling you, I've never seen someone so eager to reclaim the past and articulate a new understanding of the past than, of all the political figures I know, than Nina Turner.
Absolutely.
I'm just thrilled that she's been willing to be a friend.
Yeah, I mean, she just, like, the way that she speaks, she's able to make those connections that resonate with people and then, like, expand people's thinking in the directions that we need right now.
Yeah, I want to give people advice as to how they should choose who to vote for at the outset. It.
The official advice column. Let's go.
Okay, here it is. So, if somebody tells you they want to be your champion, sounds good, but be skeptical. If they inspire the fight in you, in other words, if they say they want to be your champion in the fight, that's okay, but listen closely and feel what you're hearing and ask yourself, is this person inspiring the fight in me? That was Bernie, and that's Nina Turner.
For sure.
Okay? That's the kind of that, and I say this because in the middle of the 2016 campaign, was it 2016? Yeah, the 2016 and 2020 campaign. I kept thinking about how Hillary Clinton kept saying she wanted to be our champion in 2016, but she never said anything that would inspire the fight in us. She always kept telling us what she couldn't do. She couldn't support the $15 an hour. She couldn't support absolving students of their debt. She couldn't do all these kinds of things. And then in 2020, when it was Bernie versus Biden, once again, Bernie was talking about the struggle. He was talking about not me, us. Now, not me, us may sound like another version of the do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But it was far more radical even than that. What he was saying is, when I'm elected president, if I am elected president, I can't do these things just because I'm elected. I need you out there pushing us. He had the FDR sensibility.
Absolutely.
Okay. And Biden never did that. And and as I said, even now, he still doesn't do that. So remember, the truly progressive candidate is not the one who promises to fight for you. It's the candidate who inspires the fight in you.
I agree with that. That's very well said. Do we have time for one more question?
I do. Do you?
Yes. All right. So let's get it. How can workers cooperate internationally when governments collude against their populations by sharing info, arms, etc.? So, like, we're talking about, like, just global worker movements. Like, we're all so divided, like, and the governments are going to try to, keep us from talking to each other. And, they're going to try to, on all that stuff. So, internationally speaking, like, what do you think? Like, should we be going in that direction? Like, and how so?
Well, clearly, there needs to be international solidarities. Okay. And, I mean, the tragedy of the Russian endeavor to conquer the Ukraine is a sign of the imperative to having established solidarities earlier. Okay. And I think that we Americans, especially during these last number of years, I can't remember the exact number that I used to tell people, that we've sort of focused all of our attentions when we're not focusing on our own navels. Okay. And I'm not saying anyone in this audience does that alone, but navel gazing is dangerous for a start. It's also dangerous to merely attend to what's going on inside of the United States. Simple little advice is start watching or listening to the BBC if you want to hear what's going on overseas. But the other thing is, see if you can connect to podcasts and shows that emanate from other countries that are voices of progressives, voices of labor movements. And if you can, then, if you're part of any group, see if they used to have what they call the sister cities movement, something like that. Well, create solidarities from the ground up, reach out, see if organizations can link up and connect in some way. Once upon a time, there was a serious socialist international, socialist and social democratic parties that connected. And DSA was a part of the Socialist International. How did we revive that? Well, right now we are so removed from the moments of strength on the left, like the 1930s, the 1960s. I mean, I wish I could tell you exactly what could change the scene, but I do think that we have tools that we can use, the internet, media, email, direct messaging. I mean, start talking to people, see what they have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with that for sure.
Here's something I can tell you that it actually brought me to tears. There are times where people from overseas who are in struggles, I mean, really serious struggles, who've said, somehow they've read English and they could read these things, and their ability to read about, don't laugh, I mean, Thomas Paine gave them hope.
Sure.
There was a German labor unionist a socialist who volunteered to fight with the Kurds against Saddam Hussein. And he sent me a note and he said he was multilingual, and he was sharing the words from my Thomas Paine and the Promise of America book with his Kurdish fellow fighters. And everybody was finding hope in those words. The trick is, can we communicate enough to get these words, expressed and heard and translated?
Yeah, that's a big thing that the internet really does help, is that we're able to, even if we can't speak to another person, we can look up a translator online, and it's not perfect, but we can bridge that communication gap a lot easier than if it were us playing Pictionary or sign, trying to do that, right? So I think we got to use technology to the best of, because the right is using technology. They're tracking us, they're trying to get all our data, they're trying to sell us stuff. They are very good at using technology and communications. So I think the left really, like you said, listen to podcasters from just try to make friends that are in other countries, because that will go a long way, because then you'll just absorb that kind of culture and that their politics and what's going on there. You'll just have that as just in the back of your mind. It's okay, right, this is going on in Brazil, this is going on in Taiwan, this is going on in Germany, and it's important because it just broadens your perspective.
Right.
So I think we can wrap this up. I thought that this went really well. I thank you for coming on.
It's a pleasure. Absolutely. And I do want to thank you, your audience, for sending in questions.
Sure.
And in fact, if we organize something in the future where I come back, we could go a whole half-hour questions. It's always fun.
I like to have that as an option. And next time I'll do a little bit more promo, and people can get their questions ready in advance, so maybe we can get that. I thought this went really well, and I'm down to have you on again whenever you want. So just feel free, you can come on tomorrow.
Don't hesitate to ask. I sometimes may not reach out to you, and
sure.
Months coming up, you just reach out to me, okay?
Okay, sounds good.
By the way, one last thing. For next time, we should ask people to name 4 films that they think are progressive.
Okay.
Okay, and I'm going to leave you with everybody with a thought, a surprising thought. One of the most progressive films that I remember, and my kids were young then, so I watched this film a few times, Newsies.
I've never seen it.
It's a Disney movie about how the newspaper boys organized a union on the streets of Manhattan.
Okay.
And the reason I said that, just to explain, is that how often can you get a corporation like Disney to do a film on working class struggle in which the workers win?
That's a really good one. I've never heard. I'll have to go watch that, and the next time we'll talk about it.
Right.
All right. Okay. Thank you
Thank you.
for coming on. You have a great rest of your day,
You
and
too.
everyone else also have a great rest of your day. That's the program. Thank you, and you can just leave whenever you want.
Thank you.